the nature of the message tonight with Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, is it's a little front-loaded. It's a little heavy on the front side. And I don't want you to get intro weary and worry, when are we going to get to verse 1 and how are we going to navigate through this with the time remaining? There's a lot of things that I want to deliver to the text to properly understand the text. So walk with me, and we will get there, but I think that'll be a profitable route to take. Also, the PowerPoint is for your advantage. I've worked on that to make the message helpful, to supplement what you're hearing by also seeing things that are points of emphasis, but there very well may be grammatical and structural issues that my editor was not available, and I apologize. But let's go to the text. Let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Now, we're returning to the book of Ecclesiastes this evening, and specifically 1 through 11, but before we begin, I want to keep the big picture and where we are ultimately heading before you. This is important because as we work through the various portions of the book, he's crafting an argument. He's crafting a destination that we're going to arrive at. And first, I want to give you that big picture so that you can understand this piece, because it consists of several small pieces that are contributing to that larger piece. And the way I understand Ecclesiastes from giving time and attention to the book is that it's the king or the preacher's investigative process of evaluating and understanding life, resulting in a philosophical theology, an argument rooted in wisdom and folly and vanity that concludes, not all striving is after the wind, if, and there's that qualifier, do you hear it? Not all striving is after wind if one fears God and keeps his commandments. He's going to take us down several different routes, several different arguments, and by arguments, it's not always antagonistic. It's developing a course of thought and a course of discussion and a course of argumentation, and he's going to bring us to that conclusion, but he's going to go several different ways. So I want you to keep that in mind, that all is not vanity. All is not striving after the wind if one will fear God and keep his commandments. So with that being in mind, the big picture, that's what the book is driving us to. It's literally compelling us to come to that conclusion. And I want to help that stick in your minds for a moment. And I don't use a lot of illustrations when I preach and teach, but I think this would be helpful. Several years ago, I had the privilege of participating in EVOC training, which is Emergency Vehicle Operation course. And one of the most enjoyable things about it was just the process of driving a car like people ought not drive cars, because you're learning how to drive under the most extraordinary of circumstances. And one of those circumstances was the skid pad. And the skid pad, just a very simple understanding of what it was about 150, 200 yards. I'm a bad guesstimator. If somebody Googles it and I'm incorrect, I apologize. But it's approximately 150, 200 yards, and it's wide, by about 50 yards wide. It's a slick piece of asphalt, covered in something, sprinklers in it, and then you're in we used to be in Crown Vics, with inflated tires, very tight, and you had an instructor sitting next to you. Now, what happens when you hit the accelerator in a car? It advances forward, correct? What happens when you hit the brakes? It stops, right? Who's in control of that process? The driver, correct? Well, on the skid pad, the instructor also has a button, and he has a hydraulic lockup on those wheels, and as soon as he hits that button, that car seizes to a stop. So you drive toward a cone, going 25, 30 miles an hour, and when you're about 15 feet away, it says right or left. You go right, you go left, and as soon as you start turning your car, poof. How many of you have been driving for any number of years? What happens on slick asphalt with water on it and somebody locking your brakes up? You're in for a little Disney ride, aren't you? It's teacups in a car. But you learn how to keep that car forward. So the first time it's spin, 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 spin. But then after that, it's sideways with that nose straight, sideways with that nose straight. And the way they train you to do that is you find that fixed point. Where are you going? And you keep the nose of the car that way. You steer it that way. And when it starts to slide, you steer it that way. And when it starts to slide, you steer it that way. And it works. I want to propose to you that this world and what Solomon has worked his way through is a lot of things that are locking those brakes up and they're sliding. Fix your gaze on the end. Solomon's going to argue and he's going to hit that brakes and you're going to slide around, and if you're not fixed on the end, what are you going to do? All is vanity. However, if you are fixed on that which is the end, to fear God and to keep his commandments, you might slide around a little bit, but you're going to stay true. You're going to slide a little bit, but you'll stay true. And so I want to encourage you, when Solomon takes us down these roads, when they look like, wow, why did this guy experience this? Why did he do this? Why would he say these things are so terrible and that life is basically not all that exciting or worthwhile? Well, he has an objective. And he's saying, steer straight, steer straight. And he gives little nuggets of that. Because I want you to know that the exercise in the little car there, the skid pad, it was never to learn how to wreck. It was to learn how to drive. And that's what Ecclesiastes is driving us to. It's never to say, despair, despair, despair. It is driving us to recognize that not all is vanity. Solomon was wise and he knew there was more than vanity. The point of this book is not to crash, it's not despair, but it's to live well, to live as intended. And our fixed point to maintain this is to fear God. Fear God, keep his commandments, and we will do well. So fear God, keep his commandments. That's our bearing as we work through 1 through 11. It's our bearing as we work through 12, through the rest of the chapter, through 3 and 4 and 5, all the way through. Fear God, keep his commandments. Now, as you read the book of Ecclesiastes and give it due attention, you'll see that there's glimmers of hope all throughout it. It's not just at the end that he kind of makes sense of all this. He throws some nuggets out there that he'll say sometimes that what happens to the righteous and the unrighteous is it's not fair. But then occasionally he'll say God judges and he is just. And he'll say that the Lord sees these things and the Lord will do right. So he's throwing us nuggets in there. So it's not just the end, but we do fix ourselves on the end there. Now, regarding these things, Derek Kidner writes, without these signals, without those little bursts of hope that I mentioned, without these signals and their final confirmation in 12, 13 through 14, the book would simply preach despair, or at best, a mere whistling in the dark. But with them, it is saying that the abyss of final vanity is the destination of every road but one. The destination of every road is vanity of vanities. All is vanity, all but one road. And that one road is our fixed point that will maintain our bearings if we keep moving straight. Fear God and keep his commandments. Now let's turn to our text. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. You know how we're going to navigate it. Now let's work through it. Solomon states, verses 1 through 11, Ecclesiastes 2. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, and my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Now, we're going to walk through this text, and I'm going to break it down into an outline here. And I've provided that for you up here. I break it up into 4 different sections for our time tonight. 1 to 2 is setting the argument for the pursuit of pleasure and its vain conclusion. He's going to explore pleasure, and he's going to find out, will this satisfy? Then verses 3 through 8, we have the accolades and accomplishments to secure pleasure. What he does, and he does an exceptional things that no other man can claim on his life resume in terms of the greatness and the expanse and the peculiarities of it even. In verses 9 to 10, we see the end of Solomon's hedonistic work, and the pleasurable outcome in its reward. He says, I evaluated the toil of my hands and I was rewarded for it. And I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that there is reward with work and there's reward with pleasure. But we don't end there. We end with verse 11. Our final section, an examination of the work and reward. His conclusion, vanity. Now, as we work through the text, I want you to note the I of each section, the use of the word I for each section. So we have an argument not exclusively from observation, but from experience too. So Solomon, very wise man, he is not just indulging in different activities, he's also observing. He's a very, very wise man. We know that from the scriptures. He's not just observing, he's also experiencing though. So before we get into the 4 sections of the text, I need to address some key words and phrases that our text references in various capacities. Because Solomon, he's observed, he's come to conclusions, and he's very crafty in terms of making a good argument, in terms of, it'd be like a lawyer in a court trial. They're not just arbitrarily throwing things out there and say, yeah, I tried that. Yeah, I tried that. No, he's crafting an argument. He's crafting on, I'm going to get you from here to here to here to here to reach my conclusion. And part of that process are the terms and the phrases that he uses. And they're very, very important for any kind of argument or building towards something. So walk with me, and this is part of the front-loading part. Let's look at some of those key phrases and key words and understand how they contribute to this argument. So the key phrases for our passages are heart, pleasure, vanity, wisdom, under heaven, under the sun, Jerusalem, toil, and striving after wind. So again, key words are, for our passage are heart, pleasure, vanity, wisdom, under heaven or under the sun, Jerusalem, toil, and striving after wind. Now, the reason for attention on these words and phrases is that throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, again, Solomon he's making a larger argument, and there's several smaller arguments, like I've tried to continually to repeat to you, because again, we can get bogged down if we end on all is vanity, but it's not all vanity, and it's not an antagonistic argument. He's communicating, and he's doing so clearly. So with any good argument, he has some structure, as we've addressed, the outline. So we have our 4 points, but he also has key themes and words. So before we look at the flow of the argument, let's first identify those words. And the first one we're going to look at is heart. And you might say, well, heart is all throughout Scripture, and you're right. And there's a reason for that, because we are a people whose hearts are affected by truth and how we think and how we conduct ourselves. Well, in the book of Ecclesiastes, in our passage, it's used 5 times in 11 verses. That's fairly dense considering the real estate we're working with. And if you look at throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, approximately 37 times. It is one of the most used words throughout the book. And when an author uses a term over and over and over again, it ought to catch our attention. He is addressing the things of the heart. And if he's saying vanity and he's coupling that with the things of the heart, then we need to understand how they're married and how they can be relieved from that marriage. So we see heart being referenced in multiple places. We see it in chapter 2, verse 1, verse 3 2 times, and verse 10 2 times. Heart being the key element of the inner man. We understand that, don't we? We understand that as is the heart, so is the person. So it's the key element of the inner man. It's who you are and the chief identifying agent regarding what you do and how you do it. So when Solomon talks about this is wisdom and this is how you ought to live and these are things I've struggled with and these are things I think through, it's appropriate that he's speaking regarding the things of the heart. 2:1 he says, I said in my heart, I'm speaking to my inner man. This is a silent conversation. He's reflecting on his intent and motivation, his core thinking. So when he says, I spoke in my heart, I said to my heart, let me explore these things. He's examining and speaking to himself. 2:3, he says, I searched with my heart. The profound commitment he had in his pursuit of a right conclusion. Solomon's not just cavalierly looking into this. He's saying, I explored this with my heart. I want to know. I want to understand. Can pleasure satisfy? And that's not some arbitrary exploration. He's saying, I explored it with my whole heart. I did not restrain myself. So we would understand this, and he did something with all of his heart, or he did something half-heartedly. So this is the way of motivation with the heart. These are statements that communicate the depth of commitment to the action or thought. He also says in 2:3, my heart still guiding me. My inner man, the core of my person, is still being directed by a right application of knowledge and information by wisdom. And by this statement, he makes somewhat of a challenging moment in our exposition, because when we get to verse 3, we're going to have to wrestle with, I pursued folly, and I pursued wine, and I pursued this nonsense, and all the while my heart was leading me, and it was leading me with wisdom. My inner man was being restrained by the restrictions of wisdom, and yet I was giving myself to folly and to wine and to pleasure. We have to come to grips with that. The inner man is being directed by wisdom, even through these things. Next we see in 2:10, I kept my heart from no pleasure. It appears that he did not restrict himself to any extent in his pursuit of pleasure. It was full throttle aimed at personal satisfaction. He says, I didn't restrict my heart in any regard. And we saw that when we read verse 10, and we'll get there again. But that heart, it explored, it pursued, and it was unrestrained. Also in 2:10, he says, my heart found pleasure in all my toil. Do you get that? My inner man was satisfied with my work. Do you feel a little bit of tension yet? That when we walk through vanity and vanities, and I'm going to pursue pleasure, and is there satisfaction in pleasure? And then he does all these things, and some of them are out of bounds. And then he says, I find pleasure in my work, and I walk in wisdom, and yet it's all vanity. Where does that leave us? Next key word, pleasure. A little more obvious given our text for tonight with 2:1 through 11, but pleasure is used 3 times in our text and approximately 8 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's not quite as dense or heavy in the book, but it is thematically what he's driving at here. He is exploring pleasure. What might pleasure do? Might it satisfy me? Pleasure shows up in 2:1, 2:2, and 2:10. Pleasure is that which is a joyful delight or gladdening of one's person. It's rooted in whether it's rooted in a proper source or not. So it makes the inner man happy. You understand pleasure. And it can come from a positive or negative source. And so 2:1, he says, he was testing the heart with pleasure. I was examining my inner man with pleasure, which would make me happy, with that which would make me glad. 2:2, he states the initial evaluation of pleasure. Note what he says in 2:2. He says, what use is it? Almost a hedonist recognizing that he's hit a wall. Instead of pleasure, what use is it? It's useless. Remember all those roads but one. 2:10, an unrestricted embracing of pleasure. Again, my heart was restrained in no way. It pursued pleasure to its fullest extent. Next key word, and you could have guessed this one if you're familiar with Ecclesiastes. If you've been familiar with Ecclesiastes at any point in your life, it's vanity. Now, vanity is only used twice in our text tonight, verses 1 through 11, but it's used throughout the book of Ecclesiastes approximately 38 times. It's why we hear that continual repetition. Vanity of vanities. This is vanity. This is wicked. This is wrong. This is hopeless. Vain, striving after wind. A consistent theme of the whole book. And so therefore, if 2:1 and 11 fits in the book, then we need to understand, why is pleasure and its pursuit vanity, and how does that contribute to the larger understanding of vanity, and how might we be delivered from vanity as a whole? Now, again, it was clearly addressed last week. We went through chapter 1, and Pastor Josh addressed the preeminent role and the poignant reality of vanity. And we saw in chapter 1, 5 of the times it's used in the second verse of the book. Fascinating, isn't it? If it was used 5 times in one chapter, that ought to get our attention. 5 times, one verse. 5 times in chapter 1, verse 2. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Vanities of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. Do you think he's trying to get our attention? Do you think he's trying to set the tone of the book? So, if we have a key theme that establishes the book, and then it reintroduces itself, then we ought to be paying attention. Now, 3 of the times that it's used is the conclusion of his argument in 12:18. So again, stating vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Opens the book. 5 uses. Concludes the book. 3 more uses. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, says the preacher. Vanity is vanity. He's opened and closed the book with an intense evaluation. It's vanity, and it's vanity. And what does he do with 2:1 to 11? It's vanity, it's vanity. It ought to get our attention. Why? How does this argument fit? Now note that I said that he states that at the end of his argument, an argument that fails to provide a critical element that is alluded to in various places throughout the book, but is poignantly clear at the end that we insert in the discussion, fearing God. So though he says, vanity of vanities, and though he concludes vanity of vanities, he goes further, doesn't he? Because vanity of vanities, all his vanities, 12:18. But what has he also said in chapter 12? Fear God, keep his commandments. It's not all vanity. There is deliverance from this. And we see that here. All is not vanity. Don't lose sight of that. Vanity in this context is communicating that which is targeted, a targeted object, namely pleasure. So pleasure is the target of vanity's aim right here. Pleasure is vanity. There's not enduring value or use. Pleasure alone proves to be fruitless, a loss of nothing, an abject waste of life, of time, of strength, of resources, of anything. Did you get that? Pleasure in its own right. Pleasure can be tethered to that which is good. But pleasure in its own right is a fruitless loss, an abject waste of life, strength, and resources. I want to have it my way. Well, vanity. I want to do what I want to do. I want to do it. I want to be my own man. I want to be my own person. I don't want to be subject to the rule of others or the direction of a culture, of the truth or otherwise. Well, the value of pleasure has been detached, and now it's vanity. And as I mentioned in our immediate context, we only have two usages of vanity, but they open and close the argument, a limited but intentional placement for maximum effect. Again, I referenced a lawyer crafts an argument, right? They don't just throw things out. They're strategic. They have an opening argument, a closing argument. You want to set the tone, and you want to close your case, right? Opened, vanity of vanities. Opens the book, closes the book, vanity of vanities. Opened, 2:1-11, vanity of vanity. 2:11, vanity. He's making an argument, and he's crafting it. So where it's placed is strategic and necessary to follow. So the smaller argument of 2:1-11 is like the book as a whole, and that it's bookend with vanity, but demands the critical piece of the puzzle to receive its due attention. And what's that critical piece? It's the piece that can deliver us from the vanity. And that's to fear God and to keep his commandments. Now, I've told you, if a word is used over and over again, it's consequential, right? I've said heart was consequential. I've said vanity is consequential. When I say over and over again in a message about Ecclesiastes 2:1-11, and to a people who hear vanity of vanities, I want you to hear the repetition of fear God and keep his commandments, because I'm communicating to you that's important, and that's how we can be delivered from this vanity, be it in pleasure or otherwise. Again, vanity, it's freed, it's released when we fear God and keep his commandments. The first use of vanity is in 2:1 in our passage. It's the thesis, the core of his argument that he would unpack through the rest of the passage. He states, quote, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. So it opens, he closes, 2:11. The second use of vanity is the conclusion developed from the completion of the argument, a conclusion alluded to from the start and developed from the beginning to the end of the passage. Vanity of vanities. His conclusion regarding all of his work and its reward, all was vanity, is striving after the word, or after the wind. Next key word, wisdom. This is a book by the wisest man that walked this earth, the wisest natural man in terms of natural men here. Wise, and yet these are the things he's saying, so we need to pay attention when the word wisdom is used, and when he was led by wisdom, when he was accompanied by wisdom. So wisdom only appears twice in this section, but it's among the prevailing themes throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's approximately in the book 26 times. So again, a key theme. This is 26 times, but placement is valuable, right? Ecclesiastes has 12 chapters. Wisdom, 26 times. It's only in half of the chapters. So when it's there, it's very densely used. It should catch your attention. When wisdom is present, it's a prevalent theme, and it's not everywhere. So when it's used, what would it inform us in terms of these things? So 26 times, only 6 chapters. This is one of them where it is used. So there's an emphasis, and it's quite intentional where it is used. We see that wisdom is referenced in chapter 2, verses 3 and verses 9. So where does it fit? Verse 3, verse 9. Wisdom being a proper and skilled application of truth to life with both natural and supernatural applications. naturally applied to understanding and applying general truths, and supernaturally applied to understanding and applying the truths of God. So we can have wisdom in a natural sense in terms of a skilled application of things that are true and correct, and we can have wisdom in terms of supernatural, in terms of these are God's truths and applying them with skill. Now the places that it shows up, again, is 2:3 and 2:9. So 2:3, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. The principal guidance of his person is the right application of truth and principles rooted in God's revealed word. So when he makes his arguments, when he's exploring the vanity of pleasure, he says, I was still rooted in truth. I was still rooted in a proper understanding and application of truth. And that should be very informative to us. He's not just some guy that says, I messed up my life. Now let me tell you some lessons I got out of that. He's a man that says, I tethered myself to the wisdom of God while I explored these vulgar and vain things. Some things not so vulgar, some things just fruitless in and of themselves. And as I've stated, this is hard to see at this time how it works in terms of the context. How did he stay tethered? Well, we'll get there. 2:9, my wisdom remained with me. This is the second usage. My wisdom remained with me. He continued to maintain the skill and insight to put truth into practical action. He's already talked about all the things that he's done, all the exploits that he's had, and he says, my wisdom continued with me. I never was completely untethered from the proper and right application of the truth of God. And I think that's why he could come to the conclusion that what I did was vanity. What a kindness to see something for what it is. Again, it's hard to see, but we'll get there. Next, we have the two phrases, under heaven and under the sun. They both appear once in our text. Under heaven appears approximately 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Not exactly a consistent theme, but under the sun, which I would say is a kindred phrase, appears 28 times. And what I understand them to be saying is that these both appear to be references to man's or creation's natural existence or experience. That which happens under the sun is our natural experience, that which we can evaluate, the things that people experience. And so he says all that happens under the sun is vain. Well, that's our experience. So he's saying I'm evaluating the natural experience of man and and God's creation in general. Now, under heaven appears more frequently in the book of Ecclesiastes. And again, it's paralleled with under the sun, and we'll look at some of those places. The two phrases being thematically similar in attention. They show up in 2:3, an examination of what profits man during his natural existence under heaven during the few days of his life. 2:11, when evaluating the ambitious pursuits of pleasure, the conclusion was that there was, quote, nothing to be gained under the sun, nothing to be gained in this natural life. Next key word, Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was only used twice in this text, in 1 through 11, and only 5 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Jerusalem might appear to be a peculiar word to have in this list because it's in there only 5 times in the book and only twice in our passage. However, I argue and I think that the reference to the beloved city, to Mount Zion, to Jerusalem, to the beloved city serves as a key city, being that it's a key city in redemptive history. It tethers the king who says in chapter 1, I, king of Jerusalem. He's not king of Jerusalem unless he's part of the covenant people of Israel. And if you're part of the covenant people of Israel, there are certain truths that you've tethered yourself to. There are certain things that you know to be true that other kings and nations might not understand. So I want to argue that you can't divorce the placement of Jerusalem and the fact that Solomon derived his right to rule from the God of the covenant nation of Israel, from the God of all gods. You can't divorce that. He's not just some secular king out there saying, well, I'm exploring things. I'm a very wise man. He is the sovereign over the covenant nation of Israel that is immersed in truth. And it bears on his reign because he will not reign if there is no Jerusalem. And again, I want to argue that if Jerusalem was not, if its history was not, if its future was not, then yes, all would be vanity. All would be vanity, but it's not. And where Jerusalem shows up in our text is verses 7 and 9. He's basically saying, I've surpassed all who reigned in Jerusalem, all who were in Jerusalem. 2, 7, and 9, he's sharing of his exploits and that he surpassed all others. The next key word is toil. It's referenced twice in our text, approximately 20 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. and it frequently contributes directly to the conclusion that all is vanity. I've toiled, and it was vanity. I've wrestled, and it was vanity. I've worked, and it was vanity. And this is a very important part of our text as well. All this laborious work for nothing. So at least enjoy your laborious work while you live out your pleasures, or so goes the argument. Because if this is all there is, and if my work is vanity, well, then at least enjoy it, right? At least enjoy your work. This shows up in 2:10 and verses 10 and 11. He states, his heart found pleasure in all his toil, and pleasure was the reward of his toil. So it's fascinating. It wasn't that Solomon was saying, I did all this work and it was miserable. He says, I did all this work and there was pleasure, and that was my reward. It was satisfying. 2:11, he evaluates his toil and he concludes it was vanity. It was satisfying, but it was still vanity. Finally, the last key word or phrase is striving after the wind. Striving after wind only appears once in the passage, 9 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, but I included in this short list to help structure our argument as we walk into it, because 9 times in the book, and that's it, but it's 9 times in the scriptures, and that's it. And I would argue that if you want to understand vanity, it's right here. It's striving after wind. It's chasing after the wind. So by way of thesis and key words, I do think it's important. It appears in our passage at the conclusion of his argument. After he's evaluated his toil of his hands in the pursuit of unrestricted pleasure, he says it was striving after wind. I've worked, I've done more than any other man. I've enjoyed my work, but it was striving after wind, and it was vanity. Now, we front-loaded the text. We front-loaded our passage. I know that was a little bit laborious, but those words, I need you to hold on to them. I need you to think about them as we navigate through the text, because they're all valuable in their own right. So let's go to our text, and let's look at how they fit into our passage together. 1-2. Here we have the first section, the argument for the pursuit of pleasure and its vain conclusion. Now, I want you to note when you're looking at the text, and you need to be nose to the text most of the time here, because you need to follow along with the argument of Solomon. Note the I of each section. I said. He's making an argument from observation and from experience. And he's saying, I said. So Solomon begins by addressing his own heart, his inner man, the most intimate element of his person, and he states what he intends to do. He intends to test or examine with pleasure, or that which would provide satisfaction. He said, I would test my heart with these things. He's stating right up front, this is my intention. I will examine pleasure. I will test my heart in this regard. And this is framed with, enjoy yourself. Might pleasure satisfy, and this is what he's asking himself, might pleasure satisfy what this life would desire? Might pleasure fulfill the need that my inner man craves? And if you look around your coworkers and friends and family, this is the question they're asking. Might not pleasure satisfy? Might I not pursue these things and be satisfied? And Solomon will answer the argument for us, but I'll go ahead and answer up front. No. I'm going to test my heart with pleasure. Will it satisfy? Will it have the proper conclusion that I would delight in? No. No pleasure or satisfaction alone. No satisfaction alone will not fulfill this weighty demand of the inner person. It cannot satisfy. He makes this clear at the outset with the contrasting conjunction, but. I tested my heart with these things, but. And he says, I will test with pleasure, but this was vanity. I'm going to do it, but this was vanity. The testing of personal pleasure proved to be fruitless. The I got to do what makes me happy is a failed philosophy. This is a pursuit and vanity. And how many of you, when loved ones are having marital strife or people are struggling with decisions in life and they defer back to, I just got to do what makes me happy. Solomon said, I didn't even have to experience it. I observed it, I tested it, and it was vanity. It will be thoroughly unsatisfying. It'll be striving after the wind. Now you might say, well, isn't everything just going to be regarded as vanity? Maybe you've read over the book, or you were here for chapter 1 and said, well, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. We skip to the end and you keep saying vanity of vanities. The preacher says all is vanity. So everything's vanity anyway, so what does it matter if pleasure is vanity? No. No, not all is vanity. Not all is vanity. If you buy into that, if you fail to hear the skill of his argument, then the instructor is going to say, turn right. You're going to turn right. It's going to be slippery, and you're just going to do spinning around. And you'll never successfully reach your goal. Keep focused. Fear God. Keep his commandments. It's not all vanity. Solomon continues on and speaks of laughter and pleasure. And at this time, he states, laughter is said to be effectively raving mad, and joy is said to produce nothing. So he's examined, and he says, laughter, it's foolishness. It's maddening. Pleasure, useless. Now note that he singles out that which he set out to pursue, namely pleasure, and he says it's vain. And it appears that pleasure was either robbed of its natural benefit and function as it was regarded as of being of no use. Pleasure ought to be valuable, but it's been stripped of its value because of its application and the root of where it was coming from. And when you strip pleasure from truth, it will be vain. And when you make pleasure preeminent and you don't fear God and keep his commandments, then yes, pleasure, it's foolishness, it's vain, it's striving after wind. So perhaps he was looking for pleasure to deliver more than it could offer him. He was simply asking for it to do more than it was ever designed to do. He was asking for it to do something that ought not. And we see that with people, we see that with jobs, and we see that with other things. Can they be satisfying? Yes, but they are not the end means of satisfaction. If that's your pursuit, then it's vain. Solomon is providing his thesis here that there is no meaning in pleasure. Solomon is expressing his conclusion to what is to follow. He is not necessarily speaking of laughter and pleasure in a comprehensive manner. I'm not going to say that, well, if you've enjoyed something tonight, well, it's because you love vanity. No. He's addressing it in a proper context, a context of finding meaning in and of themselves. In and of themselves, this is a hedonistic indulgence, and it's mad and it's useless. It's insane and wasteful. So this brings us to the heart of the argument, verses 3 through 8. In verses 3 through 8, he's going to walk with us. He said, I tested pleasure. Now we will walk with him. We're going to look at his examination, and we will walk with him through the conclusion and the process. He states in verses 3 through 8 the accolades and accomplishments to secure pleasure. Again, we note the use of I. Each section has, I did this, I did that. Here we have, I did, I made, I built, I planted, I accumulated, I bought, and I got. Amazing accomplishments. Genuinely amazing. And we can't take that away from Solomon. If we do that, then we've missed it. We failed to appreciate the weight of the argument. But we've already seen that this is a consistent, we've also seen again, when he says I over and over and over again, he does this multiple times in the passage, and he says, I did this, I did that. And we've seen that he does that in the first part of our section. Verses 1 to 2, he says, I said in my heart, I will test you, I said of laughter. In verses 9 and 10, he'll again come to that. He'll use, so I became great, surpassed everyone, my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did. I kept my heart from no pleasure. My heart and all my toil, my reward. So very, very, very autobiographical, very intensive on that first person. But our section here, verses 3 through 8, is particularly poignant. He abuses that first person pronoun to demonstrate to us just how thorough that examination of his heart in terms of pleasure was. So while there's other very first-person heavy, very autobiographical heavy sections, this is the most intensive one. And this is what he says, I searched with my heart. I searched with my heart how to cheer my body, my heart still guiding me till I might see. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks. I made myself pools. I bought myself male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions, more than any who had been before me. I also gathered for myself, and I got singers. A vain pursuit of pleasure focused on Solomon and focused on the works of Solomon. Where's the attention on the Lord and the things of the Lord? Where's the affection for other people? I. Also note the use of plurals all throughout here. It was not just that I did a great work, but I did great works. Not that I built a house, but I made houses. Not that I planted a vineyard, but I planted vineyards. And so the pattern continues. extraordinary works, extraordinary things for himself. And we observe that Solomon's statement that he searched with his heart how to cheer his body with wine and how to lay hold on folly. Me, all my great works. And so I'm going to explore, how might I cheer my heart? How might I enjoy wine to its fullest extent? How might I lay hold of folly? I'm going to test and I'm going to examine. He states, I searched, I examined, I explored with my heart. There was a committed pursuit to genuinely and personally understand this subject matter well. He wants to know, can pleasure genuinely satisfy? Can pleasure genuinely satisfy? He is first engaging this question through wine and through folly or foolishness. He is actively exploring what might be profitable for man during his temporal existence, his few days on earth. Might he find satisfaction in this way? He recognizes man is but dust, we are but vapor, in this temporal experience that we have called life. Might I find satisfaction in wine or in foolishness? And again, he examined with his heart these matters. And I think it would be a proper thing for our own hearts to be examined, not to examine with our hearts, but to examine our hearts. Have we fallen into the same foolishness? How far will we pursue this route before we find that it is not satisfying? And again, you counsel those you love, and you counsel those who are of the beloved and in the church, and those who don't know the Lord. And so frequently, this is what we've come back to, isn't it? I wanted to explore pleasure to its fullest extent because I wanted to have it my way. It's not satisfying. He's done the examination, and it will fail. Might he find satisfaction in this way? Now, we can understand his examination of these areas, cheering with wine and foolishness, but what is particularly challenging is that parenthetical statement, that parenthetical qualification where he kind of pauses and says that his heart was still guiding him with wisdom. I pursued it through wine, through alcohol, through intoxication. I pursued it through folly and foolishness, but my heart still led me with wisdom. This examination and pursuit would appear absolutely contrary to being led by wisdom, does it not? It appears just to be foolish. So is he inferring that he's still clear thinking? Was he just enjoying himself while he was evaluating man's condition? I can't fully resolve that tension. We can explore it, because it appears to be contrary to wisdom. And what I can provide for you is help to understand what we don't always have. We don't always have the responsibility to resolve every tension in the Scriptures. Some we're going to have to leave in a state of tension. Don't say, well, he didn't really mean wine, or he didn't really mean foolishness, because that's not the way of wisdom. It very well may be that he was tethered to a right thinking about God and truth, and yet he explored these things. And how do we resolve that? I don't know. But I can tell you that Solomon was the wisest man. He would surpass us by every stretch of the imagination, and you would be a fool to think you can duplicate and say that I too was tethered with wisdom. You will not be successful. And he didn't come through unscathed. He came out marked and scarred and abused, and a man that concludes saying it was all vanity. So when you mix truth with man's fallen condition, you will inevitably have those unresolved tensions and actions that are wholly inexplicable. We can't understand sin properly, and then when you marry sin and wisdom, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. And we're going to have to stay there for a moment. But there are some good men that think well, and they've provided some potential resolutions. And here they are, and I'll read them for you, and I've provided them for you on the screen. One resolution was, he gave himself to a foolish life, yet tempered by wisdom, till there dawned upon him a better light upon the way to true happiness. Another conclusion is, an attempt to indulge in pleasure without being consumed by it. That's reasonable enough, but again, that's a tightrope that you're walking. Rationally controlled indulgence in pleasure. That almost appears contradictory, but doesn't wisdom and folly appear contradictory? Quote, his experiment was an experiment in pleasure, but not debauchery. Now that very well may have gotten it right on. He didn't say, I'm going to wholly engage and indulge. He said, I will examine and I will test. And again, I want to emphasize, you are not Solomon. You'd be a fool to pursue these things and say, well, I need to find out for myself also. Part of the profitable nature of all Scripture is that we have a man who said, I'm the wisest man, natural man that walked this earth, and it was folly, it was vanity. Heed wisdom and counsel, and heed what the Scriptures say. So the conclusion appears to be that he dabbled in dark things, and while not coming out unscathed, he did come out not wholly consumed. So smelling like smoke, not burned by the fire. It's like a man that gets cast overboard. He might have a life vest on, but it doesn't mean he's not going to choke on some water. Don't be a fool. Don't be Solomon, because you ain't. We're not as strong. We're not as wise. We're not. It'd be a fool's folly. He continues on to share his extraordinary accomplishments. And we have a concentrated section surrounding the theme of his great works, presumably actions that were good for the children of man to do under heaven during their temporal existence. Again, he recognizes we're only going to be here but so long, and so what might man do to enjoy and fully live this life and enjoy and to profit from it? So he states that he built houses for himself. Houses, multiple structures. He planted vineyards for himself. So we have vineyards and houses. So we see here domestic growth and comforts. He was very, very profitable, very successful. He made gardens and parks. And in the gardens and parks, he planted all kinds of fruit trees. So here we have agricultural and botanical advancements. And you can just imagine, and we can use a little bit of sanctified imagination because it's historical things and we can think through them properly. He says, I planted orchards and gardens, varieties of trees. You know, you go to the Atlanta Botanical Garden and these other places, these other magnificent gardens, and we read about and we think about Nebuchadnezzar and his own bragging rights about the hanging gardens of Babylon and such things. But Solomon says, I had vineyards, gardens, orchards, and trees. Amazing advancements, bragging rights. And there was magnificent breadth of diversity where the trees planted, an orchard of diversity. And then, track with me in your text, he made pools to water the forest of growing trees. That's amazing. A very, very industrious, very successful man. Orchards of trees, pools, aqueducts, whatever kind of watering system. Industrious and impressive. He was enjoying the advantages of living at a time of peace and advancement and luxury because, again, this is King Solomon. Expansion of the kingdom, well living, good times and peaceful. This was in and of itself potentially good and satisfying work. And I'm not going to take that away from him. Houses, vineyards, plants, gardens, aqueducts or pools of water. And he continues to paint the picture. And what does he do? Of unparalleled wealth and prosperity. He states that he also had male and female slaves, persons who were responsible to serve him and his needs. You have to facilitate those magnificent buildings and gardens and water systems. Amazing works, extraordinary manpower. And these slaves had children. And that further expands his prominence in terms of available manpower. And I know I might lose some of you with the word slave in terms of the text, and King Solomon had slaves. But you need to understand, if you're a good student of the Old Testament scriptures, there were clear prescriptions for how an Israelite was to care for his slaves. And when the year of Jubilee came and the freedom that came with that and what you did, and you didn't abuse a Hebrew slave and you didn't abuse a sojourner, one who was dwelling among the Israelites. But these were people, they were in servitude, they were serving Solomon, and it was at a clear, his manpower, amazing, exceptional. And when they had children, they were his children in terms of his household. And he continues on. There was also an advancement of, an abundance of herds and flocks, which would have been a reflection of his prosperity. The diversity of herds and flocks indicate the range from cattle to livestock, cows to sheep. So again, we have abundance of herds and flocks. And if you think about this, do you remember Abraham? What precipitated him and Lot going separate ways? They were really, really well off at that point in time. His herdsmen entrusted to his care. Herds, too much. This is capital. You look at Job, wealthy man, capital and cattle, livestock and servants. Solomon literally says, I had it, and I had it all. Regarding this prosperity, you can recall again Abraham and such men. So we can only imagine the magnificence of Solomon's prosperity articulated here, much less in other accounts. And we know the Kings and the Chronicles. We know of his exploits. Now, you've read, you've studied your scriptures. But note now the qualifying statement here. He states, more than any others before him in Jerusalem. He had genuine bragging rights. Not only was I extraordinary, I surpassed all who were before me. Even the reference, though, to Jerusalem, as I already mentioned, to the beloved city, I want to remind you that not all is vanity, because he is king serving as God's steward. Therefore, not all can be vanity. It can't be. But as it stands, he had amazing accomplishments, genuinely amazing. And he's, again, already been distinguished by way of buildings, agriculture, and people. And he continues even further. And he goes into precious metals, wealth in terms of precious metals. He even secured the riches of others through tributes, gifts, and likely taxes as well. And we know that Solomon collected taxes from his people, and he was even hard on them toward the end there. But we have kings paying tribute. This is a king's king. Wow, we're going to honor you. We're going to give you gifts. He literally had it all. And he continues with further reference to his wealth in persons beyond slaves. He had singers and concubines. So Solomon not only had wealth in terms of slaves and their children, not only in terms of nations serving him by paying gifts and like things, but he also had singers and concubines. Now, if you notice in your text that he says I had male and female singers. Well, that's not just to round it out. When you have a mixed gender choir, that tells us that was not the Levitical choir. This was not the temple choir. So it appears that he's distinguishing the temple choir from his choir, which would be a choir of luxury and entertainment. He had it all. And he states that he accrued many concubines, indulging his sensual desires as well. We know Solomon in this regard, and he had an abundance in that area. And that's not okay, but he did have it all. And Solomon lacked in no areas. He had a peculiar superabundance. And I know we can think of, well, in America, are poor or richer than people throughout history in terms of wealth. But Solomon, parallels aside, was unsurpassed. And he lacked in no area. He had a peculiar superabundance. And herein lied a key element of his conclusion of vanity. And you need to understand that this disconnecting pleasure from obedience will never satisfy. You can't just say, if I only had, because Solomon couldn't even get around to what he had. Again, Martin Lloyd-Jones, and this is not how he would apply it, but he would say he did most of his counseling from the pulpit. And that was basically, if I give you truth, you can work through life. But I'm actually just going to do formal counseling. Your pursuit of pleasure is vain. Your lack of satisfaction in your work, your spouse, your children, your life, if that's the end means, then yes, it's going to be a rough, miserable road. Stop swerving around. Look at Solomon. Houses, vineyards, gardens, all these things. And it was vanity. He has already acknowledged in Ecclesiastes 1:1 that that he is the king in Jerusalem, the son of David, a king who was to copy the law of God when he took office, and he was to cherish it. Again, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 1, king of Israel. And what did the king of Israel do? Deuteronomy 17, he was to take a copy of the law of God. When he assumed the throne, he was to copy it, and he was to present it to the priest, and he was to cherish it. I'm speaking to a people that have the word of God. Don't fall into this foolishness. He knew better. He knew better. He's acquiring concubines. What does it say? Deuteronomy 17, the very law he copied, not take too many wives. What does it say? Don't accumulate too much wealth, gold and silver in such abundance that silver was worthless. I told you over and over again, don't duplicate the folly of Solomon, but don't follow in the footsteps of him by having the truth of God before you and just disregarding it. He could say, I was the king of Israel, and because he says that, I know he had a copy of the law, and if you would say you're beloved, that I know you have the scriptures and that you've testified that you've submitted to them. Don't be a fool. It doesn't have to be vain. All is vanity unless you have lost all is not vanity unless you have lost your bearings. Then you are sucked into the unsatisfying vortex of the have and have-nots. The haves are not satisfied in having, and the have-nots are not satisfied with not having. Briefly follow with me regarding the instructions to the kings of Israel. Again, listen to what he says. I've said it, now I want to tether it to Ecclesiastes. And I'm going to put it up here for you. And if you're curious, I underlined to bring your attention to the text. Quote, "And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priest. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all his words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart might not be lifted above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from their commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children Israel." Now recall the larger argument of Ecclesiastes. And where is it heading? Ecclesiastes 12:13. "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." And what does it say? Right here, the instructions of the king. He may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping his words, the law, and these statutes. Fear, obedience. Your scriptures, Deuteronomy, all scriptures profitable. Fear and obedience. Ecclesiastes, fear and obedience. Would you be satisfied keeping your bearings to navigate these roads? Verses 9 and 10, we're stepping up our pace here. Verses 9 and 10, the end of his hedonistic work, the pleasurable outcome was reward. Again, if we focus on those I statements, he states that I became great and I did not withhold. This appears to be a summary of what occurred from verses 1 through 8, 2:1 being the introductory to the vanity, and now 2:9 the summary. So 2:1, this has been vanity, 2:9 bringing it to closure regarding this pursuit. Solomon has already emphasized his unprecedented greatness from those who preceded him in Jerusalem. 2:7, "I was better than all that came before me." In all his accomplishments, accumulations, and successes, he demonstrated an unparalleled greatness in terms of the temporal pleasures of this life. In his incomparable wisdom, Solomon still stayed tempered. Just like we said, it's hard to resolve that tension, but we have that tension, and we're going to have to rest with it. He states again here, "I was tethered enough to sobriety of thought that he could test, examine, experience, and conclude that all such things, as great as they were but vanity." And I think that's where wisdom introduced itself back into the picture. Because if you don't have wisdom, then you just indulge in that vanity and say, "Woe is me, I don't understand, I'm miserable, and I just can't get out of this rut." But wisdom introduces itself and says it's vanity. And Solomon says, I didn't lose that perspective on wisdom, and wisdom spoke, and it said vanity. Somehow, in the midst of this examination, which was certainly not a clinical objective observation, but one that he was quite intimately involved in, he didn't just examine from afar, he was a participant in this examination. Finally, somewhere he maintained his wisdom. He did not altogether lose himself in the testing or examination of the potential value of satisfaction found in pleasure in its own right. Trimper Longman III states, "He did it while retaining his wisdom. That is, he kept his mind alert to evaluate possible benefits during his sensual experience." So he still was tethered to wisdom. He was still tethered to tempering himself. And then he makes a very tragic statement. Tragic because being tempered by ourselves, tragic because being tempered by ourselves, others, or natural restraints, it's a kind grace, and he knew no such grace. There was no personal restraint. He says, I did everything. I didn't stop myself. You know, that's called, if we let a child do that, that's almost cruelty to children. An adult does that, it's a tragedy. And he says, I've examined, this is my conclusion, I didn't restrain my heart. There was no personal restraint. There was no outside restraint. There was no personal restraint. I let my heart do as it pleased, that it might bring me pleasure. He presents an almost emphatic emphasis on pleasure to explain the proceeding, to say, I did it, and I did it all, and I did it my way. Whatever my eyes desired, I kept from them no pleasure. My heart found pleasure. Keeping one's heart from no pleasure. This would be wicked to do for a child, and keeping one's heart from no pleasure. This would be wicked for a child. It's foolish errand for us. We restrain ourselves because that's wisdom. We restrain ourselves because that will keep us. Wisdom says, hold it back, hold it back. And again, you don't have to be sitting in a pastor's office, sitting across from a desk to say, you're going to have to temper yourself, you're going to have to submit to truth. Wisdom says, temper yourself, submit to truth. However he tempered or accomplished in such a manner that he enjoyed the immediate and perhaps even residual reward of pleasure. He says, I enjoyed it. My work was profitable. I enjoyed it. Solomon found pleasure in his toil, at the least the things that he's already articulated, the building the houses, the choirs, and all these things. His toil was apparently very satisfying. But the reward for his toil was his pleasure. He worked hard, and it felt good, but there was more to the story, because he doesn't stop with 2:10, does he? He doesn't say, boy, I did all that, and it was fun, it was good. He continues to 2:11. We understand that there's usually a reward of satisfaction for work well done, and that's a good thing. Thank the Lord there's a sense of accomplishment and joy in these things. And he certainly experienced that, the pleasure of his work and his accomplishments. But what a tragedy if this is where it ends. Such pleasure has no enduring qualities to it. That's why we see these athletes who they make train wrecks of their lives. I won a championship. I'm wealthy beyond, I don't even know what to do with myself except make messes. I've gotten it. And it's unsatisfying. And then we do it on the smaller scale. Promotion, success, working harder. I don't understand why I'm not happy. Well, fear God, keep his commandments. You'll be satisfied. The core to the lack of his satisfaction was that Solomon sought satisfaction in selfish rebellion, and true and enduring satisfaction cannot be cultivated there. You can't be satisfied in rebelliousness. You can't be satisfied unless you're submitting to the fear of God and keeping his commandments. Finally, Solomon's conclusion for the section, 2:11. 2:11, an examination of the work and reward. His conclusion, vanity. Again, we note the I here. I considered, and I've come to a conclusion. So here we have Solomon evaluated the whole of this escapade and comes to a conclusion that what was established in 2:1, that the pursuit of pleasure was an indulgence in vanity. He says, I considered all that my hands had done. I considered all the toil I've expended. I've concluded all was vanity. I concluded all was striving after wind. I concluded there was nothing to be gained under the sun. But this is not where the larger argument ends. I opened with the illustration about steering toward your goal. And what have I charged you over and over and over? Stay focused on the final objective. In our case, it's the culmination of the argument that not all is vanity, not all is striving after the wind, if you heed the wisdom that provides clarity and satisfaction, which is fear God and keep his commandments. Again, not being one that uses a lot of illustrations, there's a second part to that skid pad later in the day. So we're back to EVOC, Emergency Vehicle Operation Course. It's important to follow instructions because when you do off-road recovery, it's very dangerous if you don't follow instructions. And I misunderstood instructions. And the objective was get your car up to 60 miles an hour and drive off a curb and go back. Okay. Get your car up to 65 the next time, and then I think it was 70 the last time. That's fine because you can get up to speed and then let it cruise down over a course of about 100 yards, and you're still humming along pretty good. But when you understand maintain 60 miles an hour, maintain 65, and maintain 70, and then it's been raining all day, and you got big puddles. I maintained, and I did pretty good up to 70, and all of a sudden, mud and grass and dirt. I have no idea what's going on, but I'm watching myself do this. And then finally I stopped. I'm like, Crow, are you okay? Yeah, I think my car's a little muddy. We looked back, and at 70 miles an hour, you're probably going to hydroplane if you go off the curb. I went off the curb and apparently ended up in the field when, car goes sideways. And I kept an almost perfectly straight line for about 100 yards because immediately the training, stay straight, stay focused. I want to remind you, you might end your race a little muddy. You might come out a little bit of a mess and somebody getting on the radio and saying, boy, what in the world? And you might fail to heed some of the instructions. But I want you to know, you stay fixed, and it works. It satisfies. It's not all vanity. Stay fixed. Fear God. Keep his commandments. Steer toward your goal. Stay focused. And our goal is to fear God and to keep his commandments over and over and over again. It is our proper restraint. It is that which will keep us, and it is that which will satisfy us. You want satisfaction? Learn from Solomon. It's not in the pursuit of pleasure in its own right. You're wondering why I'm so unhappy and frustrated and I can't just seem to get my act together, and I don't like this and I don't like that. Well, examine your heart. It very well may be that you're just spinning around. You're making a mess because your object is vanity, thoroughly unsatisfying. But thanks be to God, he's given us clear direction. May by his grace we'll heed ourselves to it, and we'll pressing on, fearing God, keep his commandments, and encouraging one another to that end. All right, let's pray.